As to the general point that Peterson seems to be a lower left quadrant reductionist, that was my initial impression of him as well. When I listened to the 2 podcasts he did with Sam Harris, I was quite shocked that Sam had such a crazy person on his podcast. But this made me curious. I wanted to hear more. I wanted to hear how someone can be consistently trying to defend such an absurd position, like the idea that whatever kind of idea survives is therefore also true. If some ideas, if simply something survives, this is also a guarantee. This guarantees that it must be right about the world, where I don't necessarily see a connection. Of course, you must be right in some certain areas, but it doesn't say anything specific about what specifically you're right about and what you're not right about. It's if you're in a group of scientists and you happen to kill all the other scientists and you're the only one surviving, this doesn't prove you're right? And this is, in some way, this seemed to be his position, though, when he was discussing with Sam. It was really, really absurd. This made me curious. I couldn't imagine anyone to hold such an absurd position. So I listened to more and then found out that it was his position was much more reasonable than I initially assumed. So let me give a take on what I think he's saying with what he's saying here. I think the problem with the Peterson Sam Harris interviews in general, even the recent ones in Canada, I think were that Peterson thought he had figured Sam out from the beginning. I think Peterson had the impression that he knew where Sam was coming from. Sam Harris was this, to him, this atheist, materialist type of guy. He really uses the term. He speaks of the atheist, materialist types, even though he insists that we have to distinguish low resolution and high resolution pictures. And when we're dealing with individuals, we have to look with higher resolution pictures at their specific views and criticize them, and not look from a low resolution position and put them into identities, group identities of different sorts, and put people into types. Putting people into types, particularly people who have highly differentiated views. This is scientists in general who have spent a lot of time developing their own position. Putting them into types is a very bad idea in general, yet he does it constantly with Sam Harris, with Matt Dillahunty, with Susan Blackmore, and all the others, as if he knew what their position on specifics is, even prior to having spoken to them. As if he knew what the most coherent version of their worldview is prior to having spoken to them. However, I think from this stems a lot of unnecessary friction between them. If Peterson just sat down and let Sam speak for a few hours on his position, on metaphysics, on how science is possible and so forth, I think the result would be not very shocking. They would agree on most issues, on most specific questions. This is, if they were to raise specific individual questions on different topics that are highly sharpened and not from a low resolution perspective, where a lot of misunderstanding can actually take place, simply because from a low resolution perspective, two terms can be used in very, very different ways to mean very, very different things. One example is the notion of science. Sam has a very broad notion of science. Sam includes the left quadrants in his notion of science. He includes the hermeneutic approaches, the dialogical approaches. When he speaks of science, he's not simply speaking about monological science that does only observing and only the gathering of empirical data. He's of course also qualifying the qualitative approaches as being scientific, and he's even giving value to literature in general as something that can tell us about poetic truth for example, and something that can tell us about truths that are concerned with subjectivity, or truths about subjectivity in general. Sam made this distinction recently, where in Vancouver talk, I think, where he said that he thinks you can have objective truth about objective facts, but you can also have objective truth about subjective facts. Subjective facts, of course, are facts about consciousness, or facts about culture in general. You can't get at these facts without speaking to someone and interpreting what they say. In other words, you can't get to some fact here without interpretation, without projecting yourself into the subject you're speaking to. This is a very different endeavor from what the scientist usually does when he's just observing and just measuring. And yet this is science to Sam as well. Now, Peterson didn't know this, surprisingly though, because he insisted he had read everything Sam has written on the topic. And I think this was one of the major reasons why the interviews went so wrong, because it should have been about Peterson's position, and this is how it started out. Sam wanted to know what Peterson thinks about specifics, but instead of laying out his metaphysical system in detail, what Peterson was trying, he was almost trying from the very first sentence on to convert Sam and point out where Sam is wrong, even before Sam had any opportunity to speak about his own position. So it was a really weird interview where Sam had to say something about his own position, even though this wasn't the frame. The frame was interviewing Peterson and finding out what Peterson has to say on these topics. And it was a total disaster. Two of the worst podcasts I've ever heard. People speaking past each other constantly. This is something I say even though I have the impression that in general Peterson, to me, seems to be more integral, in the sense that I think he has more to say about the left quadrants than Sam. Even though Sam admits the existence of the left quadrants, if you look at his work for actual facts about consciousness, you will find very little, apart from the fact that it's indubitable that it exists. And this is a meager result. If you look at an average phenomenologist, on the other hand, if you look at Edmund Husserl or Merleau-Ponty, any average phenomenologist, you will find a much more detailed and much richer description of first-person reality than in Sam's work. You don't find any incentives on becoming a person, for example, in Sam's work. You don't find any detailed account of developmental structures, or of any structures of consciousness in general in Sam's work. So even though he admits its existence, the irony seems to be that he doesn't give you a really full-fledged account of consciousness. So if you wanted to know now give me in detail, what is consciousness like? What does it look like from within? If you turn to Sam's work, you wouldn't find very much on that, I think. Well, this might be intentional, but this might also have to do with what he focuses on and what he finds to be the most interesting topics. And this might, by the way, be one of the reasons why Jordan thought he was a materialist. Even though I don't know how someone could come up with the conclusion by just reading Sam, who was insisting again and again that the starting point is consciousness. But if you look for actual descriptions, first-person descriptions about consciousness, you won't find very detailed accounts in Sam. You won't find anything that goes beyond the description of moment-to-moment experience, where he describes how the moment-to-moment experience looks like in vivid color and in differentiated language. I think he's pretty good with poetic language. But he's not so good in giving you structures of experience. What are the foundational structures of experience? He actually denies, for example, free will as something that makes a difference. We'll come to that later, but this just is a general outline where I think a lot of the misunderstanding between them comes. Peterson simply assumed to know much more about Sam than he actually does, and he puts him into a type, into a category, without really having let him speak and express his individual position. So when he was discussing with Sam, what he was trying to point out was that facts about consciousness are also facts, and these facts have to be learned in a different way. In other words, you can't learn these facts by looking through a microscope or by just doing science in the narrow sense of monological science, but you have to do hermeneutic. You have to turn to hermeneutic approaches. Now, of course, Sam would agree with that, and these talks were an absolute waste of time. Of course, Sam would agree with that and simply define science as being broader than just covering the right quadrants. Let me maybe now turn to the issue of pragmatism. Why Peterson's version of pragmatism is not a reduction to the lower left quadrant, as you guys indicated.